Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you, good news for women: if you are taking metformin, you may live that much longer. There is a off switch, let's call it, for certain parasites that could help remove parasitic infections from our brain, although this may or may not actually work the way promised. Scientists claim they know what time you should be eating during winter, at least when it comes to dinner. A drug can boost the lifespan of mice by 73%, but it only works for one sex. For those who enjoy spiders and for those who are horrified, a cave on the border of Greece and Albania has essentially become a giant mega city for spiders, and may yet prove to be the world's largest spiderweb. NASA is tracking a magnetic anomaly in Earth's magnetic field, and some scientists have claimed that they figured out what is burrowing beneath Mars's dunes. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with using metformin to extend your lifespan. And yes, theoretically, this is what it will do, at least if this study is to be taken seriously. Metformin is typically used in the management of type 2 diabetes, and this is something that occurs particularly in older individuals, so again, everything sort of makes sense so far. The problem is very simply that the data is very limited and based on Germany and the USA. When we say limited, we don't just mean those two countries, we mean that there were 438 people. Yeah, this is not a very big study. In fact, this is arguably not really a study, it's more a weird observational thing. When they looked at these people, half of them took metformin to treat diabetes, and half took a different drug called sulfonylurea. So we're already talking about two different treatment protocols and no actual control group, which is something of a problem. There's also a, let's be blunt about this, a concern with the results. If you had taken metformin, there's a 30% lower risk of dying before the age of 90 than those in the other group, which sounds like it should be fairly definitive, but remember, it's about 218-ish people. Second, the metformin drug itself appears to be working on multiple pathways, and this is what's thought to explain the longevity. Third and finally, once you're at that age, you may not want to continue living. Everybody you know is either dead or on the same drug, and you've probably been through a lot. Whether it's war, famine, anything and everything under the sun that is terrible. On top of everything else, as we mentioned, there's no actual control group. This is not a random controlled trial. This is just effectively, let's watch what happens to these patients over 15 years kind of study. Second of all, it is actually a fairly long follow-up period. 14 to 15 years appears to be the follow-up period on average, which is actually quite a long time. But a long time or not, it doesn't actually tell us that it's the drug in question. There could be other variables: lifestyle, selectiveness in genes, just location, random chance with this size of study. There are a lot of things that we should be looking at and questioning. Next is a drug that is in various weight loss pills, supplements, whatever you wish to call them. And the concerns that what's in these drugs may actually be a dangerous banned substance, which, honestly speaking, is not that surprising. Supplements are incredibly poorly regulated, and you're really trusting on the company to get the job right when you're buying it from them. As cynical as it may be, trusting a company whose sole motive to sell you something is purely profit kind of raises some questions about what legitimate interests they have in your well-being.
Brother,
This is important since some of these weight loss supplements, products, whatever you wish to call them, have received considerable interest on places like Tik Tok, which is basically the cesspit of medical misinformation. And the viral videos on TikTok have been showing various influencers losing weight very rapidly. And of course, when you have especially young people, and in the case of America, just about everybody, being overweight, there is a major concern.
boy!
And of course, in the case of America, accessing things like, say, Ozempic or Wegovy is nigh impossible if you don't have very good health insurance or you're not on a good paying job, because they don't have actual health systems. And they have this weird pyramid scheme. If we ignore that, though, the concerns are actually more Eastern Europe. More people in Eastern Europe are relying on a single drug. The drug is a compound, and the compound is called sibutramine. The way the retailers, manufacturers, snake oil salesmen get away with this is they claim that the actual ingredient they're using is things like dandelion root, fennel seeds, and black tea, which are all fairly common and benign substances. Not necessarily the most enjoyable things to consume. Tea is fine, but dandelion root is weird, and fennel seeds are occasionally okay. But sibutramine, that's very different. It has a unusual history, let's call it.
You said he was concerned about satellites?
And their beams.
Any other strange behavior?
You quit blinking. He says that's when they get you.
I had a feeling this might happen. This carboxyl group sometimes causes problems.
We trusted you.
The product was originally sold under prescription with the name Reductil and was used to help people lose weight. So this is fine. It seems like, okay, it's a regulated thing. It probably shouldn't be in a product you can buy over the counter, but it's okay so far. Except that it works by altering brain chemicals that control hunger. It increases levels of serotonin and noradrenaline in the part of the brain that signals you're full, essentially telling your brain, hey, ignore what the stomach's saying about being empty, you're actually full, which could be helpful if you're, well, not American, wherein the issue is probably proximity to the fridge rather than actually having access to food. And people on this drug did lose weight, anywhere between 5 and 10% of their body weight, so again, it sounds promising. But for one thing, evidence mounted very quickly that increases the risk of serious heart problems. In fact, this became so serious that at least in Europe, the Medicines Agency stopped allowing it to be prescribed. This was a result of the large Scout trial, which showed that the drug raised the risk of heart attack and stroke, particularly if you already had some degree of heart problem. And this is notable in those who are obese or just overweight in general, as they already have a high risk of heart problems and other cardiovascular disease from hypertension. So, sibutramine was basically banned for being dangerous, and yet now it's showing up in these weight loss products. Products is perhaps a kind description of it, and it would explain why they appear to work, because yeah, they have an actual drug, but a regulated drug. A drug that should not be there. A drug that this company is selling to people without a prescription. There's also another possible avenue of danger, because one is never enough. You want more ways of causing harm if you're going to really do this properly. And it's that sibutramine can cause issues with the serotonin and noradrenaline pathways. If you are taking other drugs, and for example, antidepressants are an example of serotonin reuptake inhibitors, you may find that you're, in for a really shitty time. It can cause something called a serotonin syndrome. It raises serotonin levels, and those levels become so high that it causes serious and potentially life-threatening reactions. If you're on some migraine medications, same thing. And certain opioid painkillers, fentanyl being the strongest example. When you combine all of these things, you might just find that the reason you're losing weight is because the serotonin that has been increased is causing confusion, restlessness, sweating, fever, fast heartbeat, muscle spasms, and problems with coordination. So much so that you can't actually get to the fridge or similar. And of course, sibutramine can cause issues in the liver because it's a particularly strong medication, and the various enzymes that are in the liver will interact with this, obviously trying to convert it into something benign, and other medicines are also broken down in the same way with these same enzymes, leading to a situation where your body's not actually able to process the medication at the rate it should, leading to increased risk of serious side effects and longer half-life of the medication. On to somewhat more promising news, we have a way of dealing with toxoplasmosa, which is kind of sad because we'd hoped that this particular parasitic organism would be what led to the zombie apocalypse. Not so much because we actually want to see the zombie apocalypse itself, but for two other reasons. One, to see how humanity reacts to a doomsday event like that, and second of all, to see if we can actually get Japanese idols that are zombies. Ignoring that though, this does have actual legitimate benefits that could be more useful and far less theoretical and far less, let's say, Hollywood-based. The first is very simple. It's going to help considerably in reducing toxoplasmosa gondii, or one of the microorganisms that is prevalent in a vast percentage of American brains and prospectively even more that we're unaware of, and it also seems to contribute extensively to risk of things like schizophrenia, psychosis, depression, and so on. So, yeah, this is not a great thing to have in your brain at the best of times. The association with cats is because of its life cycle. Essentially, cats have it, they drop it in their feces, the mice interact with the feces, they develop their own infection, they become, let's say, more brave. It's perhaps not the right word, but it's probably the best description for now, wherein cats can now predate on them better. But of course, if you say clean up your cat litter, or just in general go into a sandbox and the cat has used it as a toilet, well, now you have the risk of being infected. Because it's so relatively rare though, most people don't even know about it, and we say rare in that most people don't get tested. But those who are most vulnerable, such as those with HIV, well yeah, they're basically going to have a really bad time. Also, the parasite can infect developing fetuses because it can cross over the placenta, which is really not great, because that's meant to be one of the more stringent checkpoints in the human body. This can cause also developmental issues and even miscarriage. The treatment for toxoplasmosa gondii basically involves medications that target mechanisms in the parasite that are very similar to our own, and this is a problem because the closer the mechanism is to the human one, the harder it is to treat without causing side effects, and, well, we don't have that option. So, the treatment involves severe side effects, and it almost always limits treatment to situations where infection would basically be considered a death sentence. So, people have to just deal, and dealing is not great when, as mentioned, there are some pretty significant side effects. This brings us to the off-switch of sorts, the TGAP2X-7. This appears to be essential to the parasite's ability to invade a host, form plaques, and self-replicate. So the research team has basically looked at that and gone, okay, so what if we turn it off? And, well, that's what they did. They found that by turning it off, and they did so, they were able to find that it can no longer infect people, develop into plaques, and essentially became useless. Well, not quite as useless as, say, a deadbeat dad who's gone out to buy milk and cigarettes, but useless nonetheless. The study itself, however, is not perfect? Yeah, let's say that. There are some pretty significant questions we have about it. The biggest question? Yes, let's call it that. Is simply that they used human foreskin cells to figure out whether or not the toxoplasmosa gondii could actually infect them, which isn't all that helpful. Remembering that a lot of the time, the cells that are most affected are either going to be fetal cells, so you definitely want to be trying to do some sort of embryonic research, or neurons in your brain, so you want obviously something like neurons, or most likely a mixed culture of neurons, blastocysts, astrocytes, and so on. But if this research, and that's a big if here, is to prove more reliable and better models, we would argue that this is actually really good because it's a mechanism that has no comparable analogues in the human body. This means you can target that particular pathway and transcription factor without any possible risk of adverse effects, whereas our current treatment pathways are basically like the incendiary bombing of Dresden, or as it's also known, the firebombing of Dresden, which killed millions of civilians in an effort to get rid of Nazis. Yes, you got rid of the Nazis, but you killed everything else in the process. In other treatment-related news, although this time also parasitic, it's the first death linked to tick allergies. And not your typical tick allergy, though. Instead, it's the meat allergy, or the alpha-gal syndrome, linked to being bitten by a tick. Now, understand, we say that this is the first case, but it's currently closely associated and believed to be caused, but it's somewhat hard to definitively state it is. The 47-year-old man from New Jersey died about 4 hours after consuming beef, which, to be blunt, is a fairly solid track record to show that, yeah, no, that's the cause. But still, we should be somewhat cautious. The condition, if it is this, is a allergy caused by the bite of the Lone Star tick, remembering that this tick is both spreading north and west, so there's a very strong chance that even if you're not in an area currently infected, you may be soon enough, but also that the bite from this tick sensitizes people to alpha-gal. This is a sugar found in mammalian meat, and once you become sensitized to the sugar, your body basically goes, oh, I need to destroy that, and it starts by doing so. The initial allergy symptoms are rash, nausea, and vomiting after eating beef, pork, lamb, and similar. But as the condition gets worse, it essentially evolves. Unlike Pokemon evolution, where you get cooler and better creatures sometimes, this develops into anaphylaxis, a deadly anaphylaxis. So it's death, I choose you, not so much Pikachu, I choose you. Ironically, perhaps is the right word for this, the man may actually have survived as long as he did because he ate red meat rarely. And that would explain why he hadn't had a more serious reaction earlier, and why it arguably took several weeks for him to die. Still, it's worth being aware of this and noting that the official death is unknown, but further analyses of things like blood found that he had definite sensitivity to alpha-gal, and that would explain how he developed fatal anaphylaxis, if that is the actual cause. In a similar dietary news, researchers have claimed they know what time you should be eating dinner during winter, which, presumably, unless you have, say, daylight savings, you're probably going to continue eating your meals at exactly the same time you've already been eating them. But they think that it's arguably better that you should eat, possibly, depending on how you want to define this, have your meal at about 6 p.m. At 6 p.m, depending on exactly how you work, where you work, what you do, the family situation, etc., may not be practical. But the study was fairly conclusive. If you ate dinner at 10 p.m, you had 20% higher blood sugar peaks and about 10% less fat consumption, that is, consumption in terms of your body using it for energy, than if you ate dinner at 6. This would indicate that if you are comparing identical groups, bad times, etc., yeah, the results are fairly clear. But this is where a meta-analysis helps better define whether or not that's accurate, and accurate is perhaps the key word here. If you're intending to try and, if not at least maintain your weight, minimize the winter weight gain, which seems to be a thing, you should be aware that the further north and arguably south you are, the more the length of day change, and particularly the shorter the daylight period, has on disrupting your circadian rhythms. It's not just that the sun sets earlier, it's that your body is now somewhat confused. The circadian rhythm not just alters the nature of, say, sleep and similar, but it can alter the release of certain hormones, particularly those around, say, digestion, metabolism, and similar, thereby altering how your body processes the energy you're consuming. It can, and can is with a lot of caveats, help considerably in, minimizing weight gain and other unwanted effects, but only if you consume your meal earlier. Note that there are some pretty extensive caveats, and the article does go through them, so we're not going to read it to you. You want story time, go elsewhere. Next we go on to another stupid fact, because this week has demonstrated that humans will buy anything or do anything if it's going viral in places like TikTok. Menstrual masking.
Whoa!
Get out of here! Go away!
Thank God I'm blind.
Alrighty, let's do this. Menstrual masking is the practice of applying menstrual blood to your skin, and typically in the form of a facial, to give skincare. This has gained popularity on social media, and the idea is apply menstrual blood for a few minutes and then rinse it off. There's no consistency on how much blood to use or how long to leave it on. It's just a thing. It's like drinking urine and other similar bodily fluids, except in this case it's come out of your, uterus and then vagina. Obviously, This doesn't make it healing or empowering or even a spiritual ritual. It's just bad hygiene and bad biological hazard handling. The arguments in favor of doing this are that menstrual masking involves blood that contains stem cells, cytokines, and proteins that could rejuvenate the skin. And they are right. In some ways, they could rejuvenate the skin if they ever actually got into the skin. But the layers of the skin and the way it is structured means that anything put on the surface is very unlikely to ever actually make a substantial change to what is underneath. In other words, yes, they could, but they don't. This is why there is zilch evidence to support using menstrual blood as a topical skincare treatment.
Oh, okay, granted that one missing link is still missing.
This is why just about all menstrual stem cell-based research has found that you need to basically inject it into the human body or apply it directly to an injury, not topical application. This is also not the same as other nonsense-rich treatments such as vampire facials and similar, which honestly just do the same nonsense. Theoretically, platelet-rich plasma could be useful in increasing blood flow, providing things like plasma, proteins, immunocells, or leukocytes if you wish to call them that, or whatever you wish to describe it as. There are ways it could be useful, but not like this. This is just increasing the risk of causing some pretty serious issues to do with infections. This nonsense isn't as bad as, say, urine facial therapy or just smearing feces all over your face, but we don't suggest it at all, ever, for any reason. In animal news, we have increasing lifespan of mice, which could be helpful if you're particularly fond of mice. If you're not, this could be an annoying thing you really don't want to have happen. Theoretically, you can extend the lifespan of mice by 73% just by giving them something that targets two pathways related to becoming more frail as mice get older, but only for males. Well, this is interesting given the previously mentioned news item on the fact that human females have increasing lifespans given certain medications. The therapy used two anti-aging treatments. The first is oxytocin. This is basically the hormone that most people associate with love and care. The second is the ALK5 inhibitor. This is mostly targeting the transforming growth factor beta, and this helps considerably in chemical communication channels. These become overactive as we age, and this inevitably leads to tissue damage and increasing persistent inflammation. By targeting these two in particular, you can extend male rodent lifespan by up to 73%, although that's sort of the extreme case. The more likely experience about a 14% increase in overall median lifespan. The difference between mode, mean, and median. The important thing here is that if this is true, and true is, as said, a fairly significant question, the results could be useful if they then translate to humans. So there are several major but-if questions. The test animals were all 25-month-old mice, which is roughly the equivalent of 75 years in human years, and the treated males lived longer and showed improvements in physical performance, blood proteins, and short-term memory. This basically indicates that some limitations come with old age were solved, and not the limitations of getting older as such, just the effects of that. But female mice did not have that luck. The exact mechanism isn't known, although there are some indications, let's call them. Theoretically, if given oxytocin and the A5I medication at late middle age, female mice had somewhat rejuvenated fertility, which would obviously show that there is some relationship between these particular treatments and not only fertility, which would have relevance to human IVF particularly, but also possibly that the fertility cycle, and in this case declining fertility of female mice, has a direct relationship with dying sooner. Next we go to news that should have the individual put on a stake and burnt alive as a witch. Somebody threw coffee down a drain. Coffee is sacred, and its sanctity status means that you should never discard it. It should always be consumed. But no, a woman discarded her coffee down a drain and received a fine in the UK. Admittedly, she threw it down the drain before getting on the bus, so we at least can recognize that she did half the right thing by not taking on the bus with her. But in practice, we still think it's somewhat ridiculous to be fined for that. But the question is, why? Not why did she throw it down the drain, but why was she fined? The article talks about how discarding coffee this way is just one part of a larger problem. You have a lot of coffee going down the drain in various ways, whether it's people just pouring away the remainder of their coffee, dregs from the cup when you rinse it, and everything else that could theoretically be adding caffeine and a whole load of other chemicals in coffee to the sewage system. And at least in the UK, it does raise some considerable questions, since both sewer water and wastewater from, say, gutters, your roof, anywhere else really, that collects water that falls from the sky goes to the same place. The more water from the sky and everywhere else, plus household waste, and now coffee, the higher the risk of various bits and pieces getting through the filtering process. This is on top of the fact that all coffee, whether it's decaffeinated or not, lowers the pH. It helps to acidify the water that it's in, and this obviously does have some, let's be blunt about it, concerning impacts, depending on the sheer volume we're talking about. The nutritional value of coffee, given it's also somewhat nitrogen-rich, could theoretically increase the growth of algae, leading to oxygen depletion in rivers and lakes, and this could then have carry-on effects. Now, is your individual cup of coffee going to cause this? No, but your individual cup of coffee is one grain of sand in a massive beach of problems. It's worth remembering that caffeine is used as a protection for the coffee plant itself, the tree, in order to minimize the chances of the berries and then the coffee bean within being consumed by animals, insects, and fungi, bacteria, other more macroscopic organisms. Humans consume coffee because it tastes awesome and is full of caffeine that make us function. Of course, that's because we can cope with the caffeine within it, but that may not be true for the environment, and it's why, theoretically, tossing your coffee away like this isn't a great idea. On to news that is not so great. Well, it is great, but great in size, not content. Arachnid megacities, discovered in a Greek Albanian cave. Yes, a cave full of spiders. Thankfully, not giant spiders, yet, although they may yet discover giant spiders in there. Instead, it's the Sulphur Cave, a cave that, is known to be the largest spiderweb in the world, and covers about 100 square meters. We have a strong desire now to go there with the flamethrower. And not because of the spiders themselves. Well, no, actually, exactly because of the spiders. The spiders are evil and should be destroyed.
Out of the ashes of Buenos Aires comes first sorrow, then anger.
The only good bug is a dead bug.
In Geneva, the Federal Council...
Within the creepy area that is this giant spiderweb, more than 100,000 spiders from 2 different species live together. First is the 69,000 individuals of the Tigenaria domestica, the barn funnel weaver, and 42,000 individuals of the Prindera vagans, the sheet web spider, which kind of explains how this is working the way it is. The, colonial web formation in these tunnels and from these species appears to be the first documented case. The combination of these spiders has led to unique behaviors. The cave-dwelling spiders have genetic differences from their surface-dwelling kin, and they are very much adapting and isolating themselves in a way. It's basically evolution. A creepy 8-legged evolution, but evolution itself. So yes, if you'd like to do your part and find out more, you can find the link below, but also you may wish to do your part. Just remember that there are a lot of arachnids and you may need lots of fire.
Young people from all over the globe are joining up to fight for the future.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part too.
They're doing their part. Are you?
Going on now, we have a broader environmental news and the Southern Ocean. The Southern Ocean is basically the area directly above the Antarctica, and, well, it's the area of the ocean that seems to be building up an uncomfortable amount of carbon dioxide. The usefulness of this is that, well, it does sequester from the atmosphere, theoretically reducing climate change somewhat. But this comes with a pretty big caveat. The heat that's being retained despite that is about to be enough that it could undergo what's called a burp. The burp is, well, exactly what it sounds like. Good news is when we say soon, we're talking about geologically soon, not normal human sense of time soon. The German scientists believe that as the world cools down, as we stop releasing greenhouse gases, we'll be fine for a time. But then the Southern Ocean will let out a rather significant amount of CO2 and heat, and this will basically kickstart global warming for at least 100 years again. So this is not great, but it does mean that the let's say, world is trying to reach equilibrium, everything being perfectly balanced as it should be, or at least as balanced as Earth can ever get. The reason this happens is that we've somewhat disrupted the natural cycle of things. First of all, heat would normally accumulate in the ocean under, well, normal conditions, but there would be a certain amount of ventilation that comes from warmer waters from above being swapped out for cooler waters below it. This is upwelling. That allowed for a more consistent level of heat in water, but we've basically buggered that up. This has also been further supported by atmospheric CO2, and this leads to a significantly greater amount of heat being retained by the oceans than we would otherwise like to have. And this then leads to the problem. The CO2 reaches its peak and then starts going down, but the oceans don't stop gathering heat. They continue to act as a giant heat sink that still sucks up all that warmth. And then it gets to a point where it's like, oh, I don't need to do this anymore, and it suddenly releases that heat. That heat continues to be released for about 100 years, given the sheer mass of the ocean and various other environmental factors regarding the thermodynamics of what's going on. This brings us to the fact that, unfortunately, the Southern Hemisphere is going to be most screwed by this. Which is why we find it somewhat funny when the researchers say that the greatest and longest lasting effect will be in the Southern Hemisphere, suggesting a greater impact on today's more vulnerable countries of the Global South. We don't think there's anything vulnerable about Australia, but sure, let's go with that. Other countries in the Global South? Sure, maybe. Hobbiton is probably going to be inundated with all sorts of issues. In news that's also global and somewhat environmental, but going further afield, we have changes and particularly anomalies in a large portion of Earth's magnetic field. There is a giant region of low magnetic intensity that's stretching out between South America and Southwest Africa, also called the South Atlantic Anomaly. This is a concern, let's say, particularly for technology and astronomy, and not so much for humans, although humans should probably be aware of it too. The giant pothole, or like event, structure, phenomena, whatever you wish to call it, is essentially a weakening in the magnetic area around Earth, that protective layer that helps us when it comes to, say, solar emissions or coronal mass ejections. And ultimately, it's going to have a bigger effect on technology because they're not as protected. That can cause short-circuiting, malfunctions, and if you're really, really unlucky, they may get struck by high-energy protons emanating from the sun. This can cause random glitches, let's call it. One of the most famous of which occurs with video games, where a random proton managed to interrupt a game in such a way that the player just had, by pure random chance, the ability to make the world record. Nothing that's actually going to change or help anybody in real life, but the possibility of glitches that would be significant, more so for data and function than they are for actual regular life. Next is claims that NASA has discovered a rock on Mars that shouldn't be there.
It's amazing what you've done with such a modest budget. I like that boulder. That is a nice boulder.
This is going back to Perseverance, the rover that is still currently ambling its happy little ass across the surface of Mars, and, well, it's trying to find rocks of interest. One of its most interesting rocks it's found appears to be somewhat distinct and different, making scientists ask what is going on here. The rock is in the Jezero crater, and it's about 80 centimeters or somewhere in the ballpark of 30 inches. The two pictures we have of this particular rock are from up close and a little further away, and what is unique about it is that it's unlike its neighbors. It appears to be composed of iron and nickel, and that's a problem because, well, Mars is relatively rich in iron, not so much in nickel, and strongly implies, associates, infers, whatever you wish to call it, that this was a meteorite that crashed into Mars at some point long ago. In other Martian news, we have some sort of explanation as to what's forming the bizarre gully-like shapes on the Martian surface. No, it's not aliens, although that would be far more interesting, and we don't even mean necessarily aliens with proper higher cognitive functions. We mean just any kind of life. Instead, sadly, it appears to be caused by explosive sublimation of dry ice. It may look like moles are digging away on the hills, but no, it's just the nature of how these chemicals undergo various, let's say, life cycles. What you see are various gullies that go down the sand dunes of Mars, and they've been trying to figure out what is going on here. The first explanation was simply seasonal water flows. This makes sense, but there's no liquid water on Mars that we know of, so that idea was kind of tossed out. Then the alternative explanation became, well, they could be carved by carbon dioxide ice, dry ice, and it sublimates as it slides down the dunes, and, well, yes, experimentation shows that this is entirely plausible, but they're not reproducing all of the features observed on Mars, especially the snake-like, sinuous sort of gullies. So, researchers looked at this and went, okay, our model's incomplete. Time to get back to work and figure out how we can finish this. They took a sealed environment, which simulates Martian conditions. Basically, they wanted to show that CO2 can drive mass outflow from steep crater walls. To address their problem, they turned to their box, their magical Mars box. They adjusted the equipment by making the air thin. They made the cold air, and the team dropped various blocks of dry ice onto the sand slopes across a range of inclinations and sand grain sizes. They then recorded the results with high-speed cameras. The results were basically what we would expect, depending on the degree of inclination, the volume of dry ice, and everything else. They basically got the results we see in real life. The slopes that had a sharper than 25-degree angle, the ice slides down on a cushion of gas, leaving an indistinct track. But if the angle of slope was gentler, below 22.5 degrees, the ice was able to partially burrow into the sand, and being partially buried, the sublimation process was able to basically eject the sand away, producing the features observed in this case. So yes, that appears to be an explanation. It's an explanation which they had to develop a model for, but it may be the explanation. The reason it works the way it does is that the CO2 ice block is basically translucent. Optically and in terms of infrared radiation, it doesn't really absorb any of it, it just goes straight through. But the sand or rock underneath, not so much, in fact, not at all. So it absorbs just about all of the radiation that reaches it. It then re-emits it as thermal and infrared radiation back up into the CO2, causing it to begin breaking down, or sublimating as is the case. This sublimation process has nowhere to go. So pressure builds up, and then it bursts, leading to what we see. And in fact, you can actually throw quite a bit of material quite a distance away. A block of up to about 3 meters can throw sand up to nearly 13 meters away, and this would reproduce exactly what's being seen, and given the atmosphere is rich in CO2 in winter, this would also explain how it can form a coating over mid-latitude dune fields, and sometimes in a thickness of up to 70 centimeters. So yes, they are overshooting, but they're not overshooting by that much. And the final news item we have for you this week, we may already have encountered alien probes. We just don't know they're there. SETI is doing a very bad job, but it would explain, certainly to some extent, how other advanced organisms, civilizations, whatever you wish to call them, would be able to explore the galaxy, as they would have to rely on somewhat self-replicating probes to be able to do what has to be done. Given how long it takes to travel between planets, and assuming there isn't faster-than-light travel available or something similar, they would have to have some way of getting from where they are to where they want to go. The researchers believe, and this is perhaps the big problem here, that SETI should instead be focusing on the signs or possible telltale signs of probes rather than communication from deep space. The researchers responsible for this believe it's the only way humanity, at least for now, can actually do something similar, that is, be able to explore the universe. Of course, we also have to put limits on them, because otherwise humanity would basically be creating a self-perpetuating mess of garbage robots throughout the universe, which would be terrible, and probably anger any and every other alien species we could possibly encounter. But we'd also have to do this anyway. It's the only way we can properly explore our solar system to get the necessary commercial industrialization, find resources, figure out what is, let's say, habitable, even if it requires considerable effort, and of course to find necessary things to explore and study. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions below.